Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Samantha Wehbe, and I am the Graduate Program Director for the Documentary Media Program here at Toronto Metropolitan University. On behalf of the RIC and the School of Image Arts, I would like to thank you for joining us today for an artist talk with MFA candidate Chris Donovan and Director of the Ryerson Image Center, Paul Roth. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that while our program is virtual, we are broadcasting from Toronto Metropolitan University, which is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The university has recently acknowledged its role in the history of Canada's residential school system and changed its name to redress that legacy in furtherance of truth and reconciliation. We embrace our shared ongoing responsibility for this and for the land where our institution stands. We are committed to doing our part to bring about a better future for all people who live here during this time of environmental upheaval and crisis. I'd like to mention a few program notes before we begin. First, we are recording this event and we'll be uploading it onto our YouTube channel in the near future for those who aren't able to attend today or for those who would like to watch again. After the discussion between Chris and Paul, we will commence a Q&A. If you have questions throughout the lecture, please use the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen to submit them. And lastly, in the case of a technical difficulty, we thank you for remaining patient with us while we correct the issue. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Chris Donovan. Chris Donovan is a documentary photographer based between Toronto and New Brunswick. Hailing from the industrial city of St. John, New Brunswick, his practice focuses on the intersection of community and industry. His work has been awarded the Scotiabank New Generation Photography Award, a World Press Photo Award, the Environmental Vision Award, University of Missouri, and the Ian Perry Scholarship. His photographs have appeared in group shows in more than 40 countries and across Canada, including at the National Gallery of Canada. His exhibition, Cloud Factory, which is on view at the RIC Student Gallery from May 18 to June 18, is Chris's MFA thesis in completion of his degree in documentary media. And he has been awarded the inaugural Student Production Award in memory of George Fleischman. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Chris and Paul. The discussion will begin with a slide presentation of Chris's exhibition. Enjoy.
Thank you, Samantha. So today I'm going to be talking about my project, The Cloud Factory, which is, as Samantha mentioned, on view at the RIC. And so basically this project examines issues of environmental harm and classism in my hometown of St. John, New Brunswick. I started this work about 10 years ago, but the project really took shape in 2017. I have a background in photojournalism, and that year I left my first real newspaper job at New Brunswick's provincial paper to work as a freelancer in Toronto. For decades, up until this year when the papers were sold to Post Media, all of the English language newspapers in New Brunswick were owned by the billionaire Irving family, who owned the St. John refinery, which is the largest oil refinery in Canada, and a pulp mill that bookends the city. The title of this project comes from when I was a child, and I looked up at the smokestacks and asked my father if the factories made all of the world's clouds, to which he responded, no, they make money. In retrospect, this interaction was the foundation of my eventual understanding of what it meant to live in an industrial community and in a capitalist society at large. So the bones of this project come from documentation of two primary families, the London family and the Crandall family. I met the Londons while I was working at the provincial paper. There was a story about a woman trying to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty by getting her first real job in her 30s. This sort of pull yourself up by the bootstrap narrative felt tired and too simple. But per my job, I took the news picture of Jennifer to go with the article, sitting by a window, well lit, standard sort of thing. And later, having left the newspaper, I decided to visit the family again and see how they were doing. I sort of became quick friends with the Londons, with Jennifer and Pat and their kids. And as I had suspected, Jennifer had to leave the job eventually to look after the care for children. And the story was more complicated than a newspaper article would allow for. So I've now been photographing this family for more than 5 years in their daily lives, and we'll go and bring back prints, and they enjoy having me around, and I enjoy being around. And not long after striking up this friendship with this family, there was a butane leak from a pipeline at a refinery. So a 17-hour spill contaminated a neighborhood that was literally across the street from the pipeline. Irving Oil made offers to buy these homes at above market price. So market price for a house next to a refinery is extremely low. And after purchasing these homes, bulldozed the community. Because the local papers were owned by the Irvings, there was very little news coverage of this event aside from the occasional CBC article. Out of frustration and curiosity, I decided to visit the neighborhood and try to talk to some of the people whose houses were not purchased. The people who had their houses purchased signed non-disclosure agreements, so I wasn't able to speak with them. That's when I met the Crandall family. Lisa answered the door, and we struck up a friendship quite quickly. They live about 100 meters from the refinery fence. The family lives to this day in fear of further environmental disaster, but are unable to move because the value of a house next to a refinery is extremely low. In 2018, one of their greatest fears was nearly realized when a large explosion shook their house and sent flames more than 100 feet into the air at the refinery. According to CBC, the blast injured 90 workers. The next day, the Irving-owned newspaper ran a photograph of the explosion on the front page next to a headline that read, "Thanksgiving Miracle," patting themselves on the back for avoiding casualties. This newspaper can be seen in the show at the Rick. In 2020, I began the documentary media MFA at now Toronto Metropolitan University. This period of study led to new ways of working within this project that are represented in the show, including a video piece documenting the particulate factories and how innocuous they are in the city, and how they become sort of almost background in one's daily life. And also large-scale color photographs that draw on the tradition of the toxic sublime, characterized by the beautification of environmental harm, with the goal of encouraging prolonged looking and hopefully eventual understanding. To me, these documentary modes address issues that are both of local importance in St. John and of global importance, in that they address the large-scale issue of climate change and the inequities perpetuated by industrial capitalism. On a local level, however, the goal is to help break this culture of silence and fear that has been created by the billionaire Irving family through litigious intimidation and monopolization of local methods of communication, such as local media. On a global scale, I hope to address the system of inequity that encourages the rich to get richer and the poor to stay poor. So that's essentially an introduction of the project, and I'll allow you to look at a little bit at the remainder of the slideshow to get sort of an idea of the background. So that's it for the photographs, and now Paul and I will have a little conversation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Roth, director of the Ryerson Image Center. Hi, Chris. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad that people are getting an opportunity to see this project, and I'm really glad that we have an opportunity to be part of the presentation of this project. And I'm especially happy to be able to talk to you about it here. I think that it's a really interesting form of documentary photography, a kind of a long form, complex narrative documentary photography that I think has, let's say, fewer opportunities to reach audiences today for all kinds of reasons, including the one that you mentioned, which is that very often the people that own newspapers, formerly one of the primary venues for projects like this and stories about problems that affect society. Very often newspapers, of course, do not want to show projects like this. So speaking on behalf of the RIC, I'm very happy that we can play a small role in bringing your photographs to people who really need to see this story, and who I think will really benefit from the opportunity. I'm very happy to be with you in the context of a Q&A as well, because I'm hoping that we get some questions from the people watching today. So I want to encourage all of them right at the outset that if you have any questions, please go to the Q&A section and go ahead and key in your comments, anything that you'd like to know more about from Chris, and that we will moderate them and bring them forward to him so that he can answer them. We may not be able to get to all of them, of course, but we will do our best. So thank you. I also, before we really start, I do want to thank Samantha for her introduction and to acknowledge our partners in the School of Image Arts, in particular in our Doc Media program. It's one of the very best places to study documentary photography anywhere in the world. I am consistently astonished by the level of work that I see coming out of that program, and Chris, you are no exception to that. It was very exciting for me when I got my first sustained exposure to your work when you won the Scotiabank New Generation Photography Award. And we were actually able to show some images from this project before on campus in a very different setting. But that was the first time I was able to have a really sustained engagement with your pictures. And I was kind of stunned by the level and sophistication of the narrative and your image making. I feel like, you know, I can say this without hesitation, that you are one of the most gifted storytellers and image makers that I think is working in documentary photography today. And at the same time, and this is maybe a little bit puzzling to some people, but I just want to say, it made me immediately worry about your story, because the truth is that work at this level, as I said, has a harder time finding an audience these days. And so one of the things that I do want to ask about right out of the gate, and I hope that this will resonate with the public, where are these pictures being seen, and what do you think is the future of these photographs, given that there is a very powerful corporation that does not want them seen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, and I think that question has to be answered based on geography, largely. Like, I think this work has found an audience in Ontario fairly easily, outside of the main reaches of the industry in New Brunswick. It's much harder to have the work seen in New Brunswick because, you know, obviously the newspapers are a no-go. You know, there's not a lot of other media outlets. CBC has ran some pictures before. You know, it's hard with galleries. I will have a show in Moncton next year at the Aberdeen Cultural Center, which is, you know, not an artist-run center, but run by artists and not funded by industry, which is rare there. So But ultimately, the goal is to have this work be a book. We have the benefit of the slideshow format here, being able to show quite a few pictures, but in the gallery space, it's difficult. There's 17 pictures in the show, alongside video work and some larger scale vinyl images. But yeah, a book is the primary goal. And it's really, like I sort of mentioned in the intro, it's a very different goal showing the work in Toronto versus showing the work in the Maritimes. Outside of New Brunswick, not a lot of people know about the Irving family. Not a lot, like one of the biggest landowners in the world, which shocks people. This is a family with several billionaires in the poorest province in the country. So the wealth divide is extremely massive. And because of this sort of culture of secrecy and of falling in line because they're the primary employer and people not wanting to shake the trees too much, it hasn't really gotten out. So in Toronto, I just want people to know about this. Whereas in New Brunswick, it's a very different goal where I want people to try to break this culture of silence and intimidation, and speak publicly, because everyone sort of whispers about this record of environmental harm and toxification of communities and human harm, that is caused by these particulate producing and toxin producing refinery and pulp mill and factories, right? So yeah, the goal is different, really, but ultimately the goal is a book that hopefully will reach both audiences in the Maritimes and elsewhere.
One of the questions that we have been asked is, in fact, about the Irving family and whether you have ever interacted with them or people that work with them, and if so, what can you characterize that, and has it affected your project in any way? I mean, obviously, it has affected public receptivity to the pictures, but has it actually had an effect on how you've made pictures or how you've sought an audience?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really had interactions like personally, but I know that like through photographing, I'm always stopped by Irving security whenever I'm near the refineries, and it happens very quickly. And so I can tell I'm on a list somewhere, it's like, it's about to that level, right? So it's, but no, I think they want nothing to do with me and I want nothing to do with them, really. But yeah, like the reach is beyond personal communication, right? It's sort of hard to describe, but in New Brunswick, it sort of touches everything. I mean, our premier, Blaine Higgs, was an Irving Oil executive. It's even to the levels of government that there's this like unspoken control. And yeah, so it affects everything. It affects the way that I do everything, and like thinking about making a book. It's like, if I go through a local publisher, are they going to they might not want to touch this, so they'll have more local distribution options. And it's, even down to how much do I want to write about this? How much do I want to talk about it in an outspoken sort of way? Do I want to try to fly under the radar? And then if I do, it feels like, am I then, working sort of against the point, which is to break a culture of silence. So it's complicated, and you see this with photographers who work in ways addressing environmental harm, and especially working with industry. I mean, you spoke with Edward Bertinsky recently, sort of a famous example of, do I mention a company? Will I then lose my access? It's a concern, but I've chosen a different route, and I feel comfortable having chosen that route.
Yeah, that's a very good example. Having worked with that and having a relationship with that, I can say that that has been a vexing question for him throughout his career, and one that he's even changed position on over time, because of course access is, pivotal to the type of work that he does, or at least at one time it was more. I think it's not as pivotal as it used to be, but at one time it was.
Yeah.
And also in thinking about audience, if you want minds to be open, it's very hard when you're in contested territory to
Mhm.
have that, because people see you as being on one side or another. And I know that
Yeah.
that's been a very vexing problem for him. Added to that, climate change is a subject that many people still do not want to hear about, do not want to think about. And there are not a lot of narratives in culture that connect specific events, specific examples of environmental harm to the larger problem of
Mhm.
climate change. And I wonder if you could speak about that a little bit, about how you see this fitting into that larger narrative. We've had a couple of questions about the relationship between your work and climate change.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of climate change touches everything, right? In the same way that industrial capitalism touches everything.
Right.
And these are, I feel strongly that in order to talk about this, we need to talk about it on a micro scale as well as a macro scale. Um, you hear the term humanize all the time, right? It's like to see a human face that this is affecting, and talking about like the, being on sides. This is part of the reason that I've moved toward, the art and academic worlds as well as the journalism world, is because I feel like, of course, I've chosen a side. I'm on the side of the people, like the people who are being hurt, by this toxicity. And the reason I talk about this is because I believe that that's wrong. I believe that there is something that has to be talked about. And I think that talking about it on a local scale is in some ways the only way to talk about it.
That's interesting.
We all need to talk about it on a local scale. I mean, you think about the way we talk about making changes in our lives, like, and there's this narrative that's like, oh, why make changes when the corporations are the ones doing the real harm? It's like, well, the corporations are in our communities. And in St. John, for example, the corporation almost is the community. Like, we're talking about a company town. And it's like, if we want to make changes, we have to make changes in a community that will not accept blatant environmental harm and blatant toxification of communities. And that in a lot of ways is a personal change. And so much of a personal change that it's like me saying, I'm going to be willing to talk about this thing is a personal change in my life. And I think really change on a scale can only happen slowly and in small steps. So to me, I hope that talking about it is one of those small steps, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I would say visualizing it too. I mean, pointing to and illustrating for people what it actually looks like to have a plant, a factory like this nearby, to have emissions like this actually in your air, to be proximate, to have a community built around that company industry and that corporate mindset of turning a blind eye to these kinds of environmental harms. I think visualizing that was one of the biggest challenges that you faced, and then I would say beyond that, shaping a narrative from those images, which you've done in a very complex way. This is a long form story. You worked on it for a period of many years. And I wonder how you thought about that challenge of visualizing everything from the toxicity of the environment, which is the thing that would have tripped me up if I set out to make images. How is it that I actually illustrate this for people and tell them without words what the problem is? And then beyond that, obvious and quite significant visual challenge, how do you then visualize the impacts of living in a community that is affected every single day by these toxic agents, by this company that doesn't want to hear dissent?
I think that second part is the really hard one. How is it truly affecting people? So Rob Nixon, environmental scholar, talks about this term slow violence, affecting largely impoverished communities that become more deeply impoverished by their proximity to contaminating bodies like refineries or mills or so on and so forth. and this slow violence is hard to, so from like, let's back up a bit. Like I come from a photojournalism background. Like that type of photography is rooted in this like Henri Cartier-Bresson idea of the decisive moment and the peak action, which, was created because you want something on the front page of a newspaper that draws people's attention. That's something that we all know subconsciously. And with something like slow violence, there is no drama in some way, it's like it's every day. And so because of that, I had to find ways to address it in sort of a slow way. And to me, that is just simply photographing daily life. And sometimes these photographs of daily life include pictures of the environmental harm itself, say of the factories, of the pipelines. But sometimes it's just a reminder that it's people at the basis of everything that is happening here at these communities. And it's like kids playing, living their lives, just people going about their lives is within this context of environmental harm is really like how it plays out. And the harm that's happening inside, like, cancer cells mutating, is unseen. It can't be seen, but we can see people's daily lives. So it's not necessarily a compromise, but it's a different way of thinking about photography.
One of the ways that seemed evident to me that you were trying to convey this complexity is through the sequencing of your images, which people can experience, even though you have not finished your book yet. People can experience that even just by going to your website. And I know that, like any long form narrative that has some kind of news value, there are probably different contexts in which the work has appeared. For example, our exhibition, a beautiful exhibition, but it's quite small. The space that the show is in is quite compact, and I'm sure that it was a real challenge for you to think about how to tell the story in a room, first of all, on a wall, not in the pages of a magazine with captions, or on a website with all of the distractions that go along with that. And a lot of the force of your narrative is between the images. For example, at the very beginning of the slideshow that you just showed our audience, you transition from images of the emissions from the factory to images of cigarette smoke in front of the face of a person. And so there is this movement, a kind of a visual movement into people's lives and into the neighborhood. It introduces us to the people, to their houses, to their neighborhood, to what they do in their daily lives. And this goes so far as to include events that may not seem directly related to the environmental harm. I think of an image that you made of what looks like a punk rock show in a bar. And I wonder if you can speak to that, to how, when you do make a book and when you do tell the story fully in the format that you're really aiming at, how much do you intend to actually make plain through text and through description? Or are you really aiming at a kind of elusive and visually told narrative?
Yeah, I think my goal typically is to find visual metaphor, and through sequencing, images that communicate with each other in some way, which is what draws me to the book as a form. The image that you see and the image you see after you flip the page inform one another and create new meaning. Like with every memory of the last image, like you said, with the smoke from the refinery and then the cigarette smoke, and through like that's through subject, but also through form. So like you saw on the slideshow, like the kid learning to shoot and then the girl sort of playing with her bike, creates this sort of visual flow that is subconscious, but allows us to think about the connectivity of, life in general, but also our systems that we live under, which is sort of the ultimate goal, is for me to get people to think about how these economic systems touch every aspect of one's life. And that's when it, you say like the punk show, for example, like that was at Taco Pico, which was like it's closed now, but it was a restaurant that was sort of locally famous for turning into a music venue at night. And it closed. And the closing of it has, of these types of venues, of places for play and spirituality and community, they're affected by the larger economic system, which is in St. John, a monopolized economy, which these company towns, and part of it is like, you look at the history of these company towns, they only end one way. These industrialized communities inevitably become post-industrial. Once the monopolized industry collapses. So I work a lot in Flint, Michigan, for example, which is a company town run by GM. Once the car industry collapsed, the factories left and the city became post-industrial, which, it's now in a period of transition and probably will be for a long time. And through that period of transition, we saw a lot of significant harm and death and, out-migration on a mass scale that left half of the city empty, more than half. So, you sort of think about these things on a larger scale in terms of how they're going to play out, how you think they're going to play out based on the history. And it's like, wow, like we're headed for something that is not going to be pretty, and watching it, it means it's not just going to not be pretty for the people who live by the refinery. It's not going to be pretty for the punks at the restaurant, like it's not going to be pretty for anybody. Right. So it's sort of like, I see it in some ways as a warning, but I almost feel like crazy that I need to have this warning because it's so like blatantly obvious when you look at the history of how these things play out. So anyway, so that's, for me, that's the reason. It touches absolutely everything. I love this city. I love St. John. I grew up there. I'm constantly inspired by it, and on a local level, I'm like, I don't want this place to see its demise, but it's also talking about monopolization of the economy writ large. Like we're seeing the global economy become monopolized. And more of these communities that are essentially owned by one person. Right. So I see it a bit as a warning in that way, and I hope that people are able to hear it. Yeah. But I don't know.
We're getting a lot of questions, and a number of them touch on the reaction of the community itself. And so I wanted to ask you, on behalf of one of the people watching today, how have you been, what kind of reception have you actually heard about directly? You've shown the work, for example, in communities in New Brunswick. You had an exhibition in Moncton. How have people reacted to the work? What have you heard from people in the community? Have activists, for example, picked up on the images and felt supported by them, and just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I also showed some of the work at a slideshow at a nighttime festival in St. John in 2019, our festival, and people agree that things need to change through sort of whispers. It's so like I'll have people come up to me and say these things who would never say publicly that, yeah, this system that we have is not working. But on a personal level, I think it's cathartic for people to hear it. And it's especially cathartic for those who have been victims of this economic system, who are really unable to feed their children unless they work for the Irvings, and are unable to work for the Irvings and don't know where else to go. There's so many of these people, and like will come up to me often and say like, thanks for seeing me. Like when this was shown in St. John, that happened a lot. And that to me is what matters. I don't like people from the suburbs, who are gainfully employed at the refinery, or some executive of some kind might say, they might feel offended by this work. And that is ideal to me. I hope that they are. And I don't want to ever like blame workers for this. Like, I know that I don't fault anybody for needing to make a living.
Right.
But, you know, there has to be, like, I want to encourage workers to have these kinds of conversations. And like, you don't see unionization in these refineries because it's like this history of union busting. And, you know, so I don't like, I want the executives to be upset, sure, but I also don't want to alienate workers, which is really important to me. And like, you know, when I talk to workers at the refinery on like outside of the executive level, people aren't happy, you know. It's like, and there's so much, you know, contracting that's happening, and, you know, so yeah, it's a complicated little story at the end of the day. You know? It's a complicated little system.
Yeah, we've received some questions about the people that you are photographing and their reaction. Not only, you know, there's not only curiosity about the community and its reception of the work, but also the people who are in your pictures. And I wonder if you could talk about that. How did you, I mean, you've already said how you found the families at the heart of your project, but how have you shared the work with them? Are they following what you're doing as you're exhibiting the work? And that's the first question I'll ask, and then I'll have a follow-up from another reader as well, or listener, watcher.
Yeah. So with Lisa, who lives by the refinery, she's very invested in this issue of environmental harm. And when I first met her, she was nervous at first because she thought I might be with the Irvings, because in their community, there's often particulate matter that will settle on the houses and cars, and people from the company will go around and collect samples and hand out gift cards to their gas stations. And she thought I was one of these people. And then we started talking, and she realized I wasn't. And once that happened, she was like, okay, like, I need my story told. You know, it was almost that simple. She felt like nobody was listening to her. So she often shows me things, like she does her own like research on these types of things, and will often pull up articles and send me these things. She just doesn't know how to get this information heard, you know, and I feel like I have an avenue to have the information heard. And the London family has been great. I mean, you know, I'll often bring them pictures, and I'll bring book dummies and flip through with them and talk about, you know, what pictures they like, and I'll bring back prints of their favorite ones. And Jennifer actually came out to the first screening of it, and was very touched by it, and that meant a lot to me personally. But at the end of the day, like, this is a bigger deal to me than it is to them, right? Like, they're in the pictures, but it's like, oh yeah, your photo thing, you know. It's like, yeah, you come by, do your photo thing, you know. They don't. It's not like, to me, it's so much of what I think about, but to them, it's like, oh, I'm stopping by and taking some pictures and, you know, doing my little exhibitions. And it's like, it's not that big a part of their daily life. Right? To me, I think about it all the time. So it's always an interesting relationship with those kind of things. But, you know, I've watched, like, on both families, like, the kids grow up, and these guys mean a lot to me. And yeah, I think about them often, and I'm always happy to come by, and they're always happy to see the pictures. And, you know, we've always just sort of been friends, like, since the beginning. And that's, to me, important in this kind of work, where it's like we feel like we're in it together a little bit.
Yeah. Now, you've spoken to the universality of this kind of environmental harm and this kind of activity on the part of corporations. And we've received a couple of questions about that. For example, and you yourself have mentioned Flint, Michigan, as another example of a town in the US that's going through very similar things in the last number of years. And there's so many other examples. I'm about to go to Detroit, for example, this weekend, another town that has been quite heavily impacted by a corporation and by its movement in and out of the community. One of the questions that we received, though, is a sort of inquiry And it comes with the comparison. The person who is asking the question mentions Hamilton as yet another example closer to home, and wonders, can you speak to the universality of your approach and the universality of the experience of the people you photograph, with a particular understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusion in your approach? In other words, do you envision finding another example of this in the future in another community? And how would you approach that? And how would you perhaps think about the experience of the people you're photographing as you move forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the ethics of documenting communities like this, it's different in every community. Like there's a long history of documenting environmental racism. Someone like LaToya Ruby Frazier, who my work is often compared to and critiques and that sort of thing. It's really a different issue in some ways, like at the crux, sort of similar, but and I feel that in Flint as well. There's like in Flint, it's different than photographing in St. John because there's an environmental racism component, whereas in St. John that we're really looking at environmental classism. Most of the people affected are white, and that changes things. But in terms of the universality of the experience of being in these communities, like when I've talked about this sort of anecdote of looking up at the factories and seeing clouds, when I do talks and these sort of things, inevitably someone from some industrial community tells me I thought the exact same thing as a kid. So there's this universality of like childhood innocence, and that childhood innocence being broken at kind of a young age when you grow up in an industrial community. And interestingly enough, I think in terms of visual metaphor, one of the first visual metaphors we all experience is looking up at the clouds and seeing a whale, seeing a horse, like thinking this thing I'm seeing means something else.
Right.
And so there's both learning of visual language and this sort of waning of childhood innocence. But yeah, like further to your question about different communities, this is an issue that I'm interested in, and will always, I think, be interested in and always try to photograph. And I'm at the beginning of a project about this also in St. John, about the Willistic St. John River, which goes up the length of New Brunswick and is in the midst of funny enough, a name change or a proposed name change, and also a land claim dispute. So this has to do specifically with Indigenous unceded territory. So the way that I approach photographing an Indigenous issue would be very different than like my hometown in a settler community. And there are still, obviously, this settler community, there are Indigenous issues inherent within it, right? Like this is unceded territory that the Irvings are working on. But there's an element of environmental racism when you then look at the river and the ways that the pulp mill is dumped into the river and paid the fines, because that's just simply the cost of doing business. So yeah, like there's these issues exist everywhere, and I hope more people photograph them. And to your point, they do need to be photographed in thoughtful ways and in different ways, depending on where you might be. Like Hamilton, for example, as was mentioned, has its own set of issues. It's very different being in the GTA and becoming part of urban sprawl. That creates a whole other set of things to think about. And gentrification, for example, becomes another problem. And all of these things, I think, as a photographer, you need to research in rigorous ways to try to understand just the basics of what might be going on, and also listen to people. Like, because to me, the true experts are people experiencing these things every day. Like, I can read as much as I want from sociologists and economists about, company towns, but at the end of the day, what the people that I'm photographing tell me their daily lives are like means more in a lot of cases than what these like experts are saying. And they're both important, but I place a lot of importance on lived experience, and I think you sort of have to, working in this kind of way.
Yeah. I'm thinking in a very different way about the universality of these stories. Depressingly, of course, situations like this are not new. And, we've received a number of questions about influences on your work. One that pops right to mind and that makes the point that that these kinds of situations that you're photographing are not new is the great project by W. Eugene Smith, which involved him going to a culture that was unfamiliar to him, going to Japan and photographing the Chiso chemical plant in Minamata, and doing a project that's now become quite legendary. In fact, there was even a film that came out a couple years ago starring Johnny Depp as W. Eugene Smith. I will say that, like the person watching today who asked this question, I thought about Gene Smith right away when I saw your work, primarily because of the way that he also struggled with visualizing something that is in many ways not visible, which was the chemicals that were being dumped into the water supply for the town that were then affecting people generationally, causing, for example, birth defects. And at the same time, I think that there are visual correlations, stylistic correlations between your work and Gene Smith. And so a number of people have actually asked if you're using film or digital. And in this context, I think that's a really interesting question, because there is something about the particular kind of work that you're making that tends to be evocative, almost metaphorically so, of a certain way of looking at a story, a certain way of thinking about the drama of the invisible, and thinking about visualizing what you called slow violence. So I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit.
I have a great admiration for these photographers, these early documentary photographers, all the way from, Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, the FSA photographers, up to, Gene Smith, Eugene Richards, and more recently, like Darcy Padilla has had like a great influence on my work. Her Family Love project, there's these sort of long-term things. And yeah, I've actually, funny enough, like in that slideshow, there's both digital and film photography, because this was done over such a long period of time. It actually started on black and white 35 millimeter film, and then has changed over time. It's been like 10 years. My career has been about 10 years. So it's sort of like the first real project that I started, and it's this project has grown as I've grown, in terms of the ways that it's photographed and the medium that I use as well. But yeah, like I think about that kind of work often. Like this, I think the conventions that were established in like magazine photography in the 60s and 70s is very interesting to me, and I've always kind of enjoyed playing off of that style, and in some ways trying to pull it into the 21st century without losing it, because I think like a lot of people think of that style as very old school, and which is fair enough, but I don't think that it needs to be simply not done because it's an old school type of style, but it does, I think, need to be built upon, and part of like using that color imagery, the sort of abstract, toxic sublime type imagery, is trying to bring the whole thing, not trying to make a project that doesn't look like it was made in the 60s, which if you saw just the black and white, you could be like, is this from the 70s? Maybe, if you didn't see the modern cars, right? But yeah, it's very interesting to me, those projects, and like you said, how they've struggled to address the invisible. And for people like W. Eugene Smith, for example, you look at the Minamata book and it's addressed through text, right? There's so much text in that book, which is really not a convention that's popular these days, and not necessarily a convention that I'm attracted to either. So the struggle of how to do it without text is is something I think about often. And to me, like the video piece that's in the gallery does it a little bit, but that's something you can't have in the book, right? When you talk about moving between the different spaces of the gallery and the book and the magazine and all these different ways of showing work, they have to be transformed, you know, in order to fit the medium. So yeah, like you looking at the clouds and photographing the clouds themselves, and hopefully, you know, photographing them in a way that is beautiful, that encourages people to look for a long time. Hopefully that will encourage folks to like see them, you know, and on a local level. When people from St. John look at that work, they often I'll hear the comment, "Oh, like I sometimes forget that the factories are here," you know, because they're in the background all the time. And the two of them, which sandwich the city, you can see a smokestack at all times, no matter where you are in the city. So it's like they disappear, right? So looking at them really closely, I hope encourages people to stop forgetting about them.
Yeah.
And I think that's my approach, I think, to try to document the invisible, but there's been many.
Right. We've had 3 or 4 questions about the role of your pursuit of the project within the context of an academic degree program versus the kind of deadline-driven work that one has traditionally done, working as a photojournalist for a publication. And I think it's a really, really interesting question. It's obviously very relevant here because, of course, the exhibition that's providing the occasion for this conversation is in the context of your thesis project. I mean, this is your thesis project at the Doc Media program, the master's degree at TMU. And so I wonder if you can speak to not just why you're working in this context. I mean, in some ways you already answered that earlier, but how it is that your project was shaped by the experience of doing it within a degree program, and how you think that separates it from the kind of work that you might have done if you had been assigned this project by a publication, say 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, if I had been assigned the project, it would not be nearly as many pictures as there are now, I don't imagine. But I think about someone like Eugene Richards, who, you know, Dorchester Days is a big inspiration to me. And you look at the original publication of Dorchester Days. So for those who don't know the background, he was assigned by Time Magazine. He took forever. It was his hometown, similar to, you know, I'm photographing my hometown. He kept saying, I need more time, as it's a complicated story. And they got fed up with him and they said, okay, you're done here. We're done with this. We're not waiting for you anymore. And so he said, you know, this is important to me. I'm going to keep doing it. And then once he published that first book, it looks like Time Magazine. He has the red border and it's like, this is my own Time Magazine. They wouldn't pay for me to do it. So here it is. This is how I would do it. So I like to think I have a bit of Gene Richards in me, you know, that like that I just am a little bit relentless with these things that I care about. So even if I were assigned, I probably would continue, even if it were in those days. But in terms of the academic world, and like part of the main reason that I wanted to do an MFA was that I wanted to teach photography. But the second reason, which is just as important, is that I wanted to build upon this project and I wanted to have it backed by more rigorous research. So, you know, like I actually had a book deal sort of lined up in 2019 before I started the MFA, and I thought, I was looking at the work and I was thinking, there's something missing. You know, I didn't know what it was, but it felt like there was something missing. So in Gene Richards' style, I said, I'm done with this. I can't do this. I need more time. And I'm really glad that I did, because giving it time to breathe, and also, like, you know, spending a lot of time reading about different ways of documenting environmental harm has influenced the way that I've thought about my own work. And also just spending 2 years talking about it in the same way. It was like, okay, I'm talking about it, I'm saying the same things, and it's getting boring. So it's like, I need to do something else. And that made me think like, oh, is this just boring? It might be. And and so that kind of, I think when you're working as a documentarian, research is very important, but also giving things time to breathe and time to evolve, and allowing yourself to think about it in different ways is really important. Like I don't believe in rushing these kind of projects. And the further I get into my career, so to speak, the more comfortable I am with things being really long-term, in order for them to be the best that they can possibly be. So yeah, I the academic world has its pros and cons, but I feel like it's this rigorous research really aligns with the ideas of what I want to do with photography.
On that note, and we only have time for one more question, I'm afraid. We just have a couple minutes left, but I think this might be a good place to end the conversation. You mentioned that you're working on a new project, and in thinking about the future, can you tell us what you have learned through this project that you are now going to take with you to this next one and to the future of your work as a documentary photographer? For example, do you feel a greater degree of urgency? Or are you more invested in your images operating as activism? And how do you feel about the research that you've done? Has it made things even more? Have you felt a tension between the complexity of the story that you want to tell and the urgency and the need for change that you were clearly after?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. I actually struggle to call myself an activist sometimes, because I feel as though I have opinions, but what I'm telling and what I'm demonstrating is truthful. And so I do feel still like, a journalist with a bias in some ways, which in a lot of ways is everyone who functions as a journalist or as an artist. We all have biases, and I think we're now becoming more open to being honest about them. But, moving forward, I think that the main thing that I've taken from this project is just like allowing a lot of time for things to breathe, allowing time for things to unfold, and also not getting blinders on. It's like I started this project. When I started this project, I thought it was going to be about child poverty. So St. John has a neighborhood with a 50% child poverty rate, which is the highest in the country. And I was photographing kids a lot in these neighborhoods, and I was like, why? So it was sort of simple in the beginning, and then I started thinking, why is this? Like, why does this community have such massive rates of child poverty? And then it just grew from there, right? But if I had started the project and ended it there, it would be in a lot of ways very simplistic as a narrative, right? Where you said to yourself, this is like a complicated narrative, because it has to be, because once you start asking questions, the questions just keep coming, and that's why it makes it difficult to end these types of self-driven documentary projects, because, the deeper you get into them, the bigger they get almost necessarily. But at some point you have to say, okay, I'm done. I'm making a book, I'm doing exhibitions, whatever. But I'll probably keep working on this for the rest of my days. It's my hometown, and I'm always going to return. So, yeah. So I guess if I brought anything, if I wanted to bring anything further along in my career through this, any learning, it would be to, allow things to breathe and not to get too bogged down by an idea, and just let things unfold.
Great. That's wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your making the time today. And I really want to thank our audience as well for asking such great questions, and very many questions as well. Thank you for the engagement.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was a great talk. I appreciate it.
Sure. So on behalf of the RIC and the School of Image Arts, in particular Doc Media, thank you all for coming, and have a great day.